선교사님은 패드릭 존스턴 선교사님이십니다. 이분은 외계 대표자로 수고하고 계십니다. 외계라는 말은 월드와이드 이벤젤리즘 포 크라이스트라고 하는 선교 단체입니다. 세계 선교의 정보면에 있어서 참으로 크게 봉사하시고 대표자적인 그런 역할을 하고 계십니다. 여러분들이 잘 아는 대로 선교는 일종의 전쟁인데 전쟁은 전략이 필요합니다. 또 정보가 있어야 됩니다. 그 정보를 위해서 수고하시는 선교사님이십니다. 특별히 이 선교사님이 지금 쓰신 이 오퍼레이션 월드라는 책은 세계 선교사님들이 여기에서 전부 정보를 얻어가지고 선교에 지금 참고하고 있습니다. 이 책은 한국말로 번역이 돼서 세계 선교 기도 정보라고 번역이 되어 있습니다. 아마 여러분들이 이 기간 동안에 구입하실 것으로 알 수 있습니다. 그리고 시간이 짧아서 통역은 하지 아니하고 대신 녹음이 다 돼 있기 때문에 앞으로 여러분들이 녹음 테이프를 참고하시길 바라고, 끝나시면은 한 3분 동안 우리 고은영 목사님께서 요약을 해 주시겠습니다. 외 뉴스레터가 강당에 한국말로 준비되어 있습니다. 또 외계에 대한 모든 그러한 것을 더 잘 알고 싶으신 분은 선교 전시관에서 전시되어 있으니까 참고하시길 바랍니다. 이제 패트릭 존슨 씨 나오실 때 우리가 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you very much for the welcome here, and I trust that in the short time that we are together, I will be able to share with you something of the world in which we live and the possibilities for the gospel that are ahead. Just a short word of testimony before I go further. For 16 years I served God as a missionary in Southern Africa. There is a map of that part of the world which you can see. There is South Africa. Most of my service was in the land of Zimbabwe. I've tried to learn a bit of 19 different languages. I won't give you demonstrations of them, but in Africa we have many languages. But for the last 16 years I have been based in Britain, where I have a worldwide ministry of encouraging Christians to finish the job that Jesus gave us to do. I want to share with you some of the trends that are taking place in the world today. I'm going to give you 5, and these are found on page 5-10 in your folders. If you have difficulty with some of my words, I think you will follow the main structure of what I want to share. You see, I also have the problem that I don't speak American English, I speak English English. That's the real English. But of course, my wife is American, and so our languages are getting a little bit closer and closer. And so I want to take as my text Matthew chapter 24 and verse 14. Here we have the only time that Jesus spoke clearly about the Great Commission that we have recorded in Scripture before his crucifixion. Therefore, these words are very important. And from these, I want to take those 5 basic points. Here I read, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." We are a privileged people today. Never has any generation that has lived had the opportunity of actually speaking about possibly finishing the job Jesus gave us to do with such realism. So therefore, we are privileged to be part of the army of Jesus that could finish the job he gave us. What a privilege! But it is only going to happen if we are accountable to his command to take the gospel to the world. One of the tragedies of church history, and I will refer to that, one of the tragedies of church history is that no period in the history of the church has the Church of Jesus Christ taken the last command of Jesus seriously. Even the early church, they did not take the Great Commission seriously. They stayed for a long time in Jerusalem before persecution forced the Christians to do the job Jesus had given them years before. And so I want to share with you the burden on the heart of Jesus as he shared with his disciples. My first point, and I will be illustrating some of these points with overhead transparencies, so I hope that will make it live for you. And may I add that if you go to the booth of my mission, which is underneath the place where we eat, you will be able to find copies of these overheads if you need them in your ministry. And I hope to be there some of the time, and if you want to speak to me personally, I hope that's where you will be able to find me. But now the first point is the unprecedented global growth of the church is one of the trends of today. But I have added in my notes, but it is not everywhere. The church is growing, but not everywhere. When I was in Korea last year, Korean leaders were saying that the church has grown in Korea for many years, but apparently for the last several years that growth has stopped. Be careful, because what is growth today can be decline tomorrow, as we have in Europe. But Jesus here gave us a definite word. He said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world. I don't know how it comes over in Korean, but there is a sense of definiteness. It is going to happen. Nothing will stop it. Our disobedience may delay that finishing of it, but it will not stop it. We want to be that generation that sees the job finished. Let me give you a few encouragements. Because if we look back over church history, you will find that the real growth of the gospel is not a thing that has been uniform through the history of the church. Many of you have been to seminary, to Bible school. You've studied church history, but rarely do the church historians tell us this fact. Did you know how little the gospel spread as far as the true knowledge of the gospel after the time of the Lord Jesus? Here we have a map in the year 1780. This is just before William Carey went out to India and the modern missionary movement began. I want you to notice the areas on that map that are red. Those are the only areas where the true gospel was being preached 200 years ago. Look how bad the situation was. William Carey wrote a book, which was a world survey, an inquiry into the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathen. Very long title. But that book changed the history of the church. And it started a movement of the gospel to the world that continues with ever greater speed up until today. But look how bad the situation was 200 years ago. But then as we look over the next 60 years, after William Carey went out to India in 1792, we find that by the year 1850, about 60 years later, the gospel had begun to spread to those areas colored in yellow on that map. And so the expansion was beginning. That was the time of the great denominational missions. But they then lost their impetus. They became so involved in maintaining the work begun. that God had to raise up a whole new generation of missions, those that went to the inlands. Now you can see the expansion also including Korea and China. And so over the next 60 years we find the inland penetration into the great continents of the world. And this was really the time of the faith missions. It wasn't only the faith missions, but they happened to be the ones who were going to the areas not yet reached. Over the next 60 years, we find that, well, I had it a bit wrong, but anyway. But now if we look at the situation today, you can see how the gospel has spread so that in all these red areas on the map, there are many evangelical congregations. I don't mean that mission work is ended, but most of the mission work in those red areas is to support and encourage and to deepen churches that exist already. So today we are living in the time of global missions. I've written that book that was already mentioned, Operation World. It has been translated into Korean. It is available on the bookstore, and it is a survey of what God is doing in every country of the world. I have tried to put together the statistics of the growth of the church of every kind in every country over the last 30 years. I want to show you the results in figures which shows those who are of evangelical theology. And here you can see a diagram that is in fact in that book, and you will see 1960 to 2000. You can see there the growth of evangelical Christians in the West and the non-West. You can see that blue line represents Western evangelicals. You can see a bit of growth. Billy Graham and many others have been used of God to raise the level of understanding of the gospel within Christianity as a whole. So evangelicals have grown in the West, even though there is general Christian decline in the widest sense of that term. But look what's happened in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. You can see the enormous growth that's taken place in millions of evangelicals over these 30 years. It is unprecedented. We have never seen anything like this before. So we're living in a time of tremendous growth of evangelical Christianity. In my seminar this afternoon, those of you who go to that one, I will speak more about that, and I'll give chance for questions. I cannot do that now. But we find that in the 1960s, it was really the turn of Africa. During the 1960s, evangelical growth was at its height in Africa, in these yellow areas. Many parts of Africa are very needy. The Muslim areas, those areas with many unreached peoples across Africa that are neither Muslim nor Christian. There you can see those red areas. But in general, in black Africa, Christianity has taken great hold. But I would add there are negatives. We think of Rwanda and Burundi and the terrible massacres going on there even to today. So-called Christian countries. We see the need for the gospel to go deeper into the lives of individuals and into ethnic groups in Africa. But basically we see there has been a tremendous success story as far as the gospel is concerned. That was the 1960s. By the way, some of these you will notice have Korean and others do not. 1970, it was the turn of Latin America. This map shows the density of evangelical Christians. The lighter the color, the more the evangelical Christians. And you can see how a country like Brazil today has become one of the most dynamic evangelical churches in the world today. Some of the largest Pentecostal denominations in the world are in Brazil. Brazil and Korea are the two countries that are the most rapid growing missionary-sending countries in the non-Western world. Latin America was seeing great growth in the 1970s. In the 1980s, it was more the turn of East Asia. I think of all that was happening in Korea, and then after Mao Zedong in China, in Indonesia, and a number of other parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia. Tremendous growth of Christians, such that today in the world there are now more Asian evangelicals than Western evangelicals. I don't know if you realize that. We've seen a shift of the center of gravity of evangelical Christianity to the non-Western world and more to Asia. But then in the 90s, we saw the breakup of the Soviet Union. There is the old Soviet Union with the different countries that came out of the Soviet Union. And you can see the different countries that have opened up more or less for the gospel. And there's been a tremendous growth of the church. Could I add the negative? One of the sad things about what happened in the former Soviet Union is the way we Christians became imperialists with Christianity and our ways of doing things by going in there and often doing more damage to the work of God than help. There's a warning we must take. Do not repeat the mistakes of history in the countries that open up for the gospel. And so we're living in a time when there's tremendous growth of the gospel. And I am part of the AD 2000 and beyond movement. Louise Bush will be sharing with you soon. And we worked very closely together. I'm the leader of the Unreached Peoples track together with John Robb. And we are trying to analyze the situation. But one of the exciting things that has happened is that over the last 10 years, through David Barrett and what he has written, through Thomas Wong, who will also be sharing, has come the idea, let's make plans to see the job finished. I want to show you several as an example. A few years ago, the mission radio, the Christian mission agencies involved in radio had a vision to set goals together. You can't read it all, but I will tell you that by the year 2000, there will be radio broadcasts in every language of the world spoken by more than 1 million people. That is going to be hard to achieve, but those involved in that ministry are working hard to achieve it. What does that mean? That by the year 2000, by the end of that year, if these plans are fulfilled, it will mean that over 99% of the population of the world could hear the gospel by radio if they turn on a radio. Not all of them will, but they could turn on a radio and hear the gospel in a language they can understand. With radio, we are beginning to reach saturation. Look at the Jesus film. Campus Crusade have gone in for this tremendous project. Who here has seen the Jesus film? How many people here have seen the Jesus film? Quite a lot of you, see? But the aim is that by the year 2000, that film be made available possibly for every language spoken by more than 75,000 people. I know numbers are difficult in Korea. I'll say the numbers. 75000. All right? And so what we are then seeing is that it is possible that nearly everyone on earth could see the Gospel of Luke on video or film by the end of the year 2000. So you can see what an exciting time in which we live. We're seeing this networking together to see the job done. We must work together. I will return to that in a moment. But another encouragement that we have to show that what Jesus said is true is what we see with what is happening with ideologies. Brother Andrew, he was the one who wrote the book, God's Smuggler. God used him to encourage the church in communist countries. he put out a challenge for prayer in the year 1984. He got Christians to pray that within 7 years, the Iron Curtain would disappear. Have you heard that clearly? 1984, 7 years, communism, the Iron Curtain gone. Within 7 years, God had answered that prayer. So we find the old Europe, which you can see on this map, non-communist Europe, communist Europe, gone forever, in answer to prayer. We are seeing our world affected through the ministry of God's people. We're now beginning to see the same begin to happen amongst Muslims. Look at this man. Do you recognize his face? All right. Have you ever seen him smile? There's a hatred that possessed that man. I know of thousands of Muslims who've turned to Jesus because of the hatred of that man. Fundamentalism has helped more Muslims to believe in Jesus than any other single factor that I know. You see, God is at work even showing the uselessness of these different ideologies. So therefore, we live in a very exciting time. It's a challenging time. It's going to be hard. But those are the encouragements. But we have the challenges too. We haven't finished the job. Although we see that the gospel is spread in so many areas, there are whole areas where the gospel has yet to be proclaimed. And so we have the challenge, even in the West, of more and more people leaving Christianity, following New Age and all sorts of other isms that must again be reached with the gospel. We also find in Western churches a loss of confidence in the gospel itself. To that I'll return. But one of the great challenges we face is that we must look at those parts of the world where the gospel has hardly penetrated at all. Sorry. But there you can see the world, and you can see the Muslim world, the Hindu world, the Buddhist and Chinese world, this area across the world where most of the people are who have never had a chance to hear the gospel. So although we see the gospel spreading fast, it hasn't reached everywhere. These are the areas which are most needy. Now, the 1040 window, about which you've heard much, covers most of that area. It is not a very accurate way of speaking about the least evangelized parts of the world, but at least it is helpful. And so here you can see the areas that most need the gospel. But when we look at the total population of the world, how many of them still need to hear? Now, many people quote figures that make the task look so hard that it's almost impossible to achieve. Now, these are the figures that after much careful work, researching the different countries of the world, I believe is a representation closer to the truth than many have sought to make it. Here we have the world's population. Evangelical Christians, about 6% of the world. All Christians, non-evangelicals too, about 33%. But we also have maybe nearly half the world's population that hears the gospel but has rejected it or have not yet responded. Nearly half the world's population lives where the gospel is now being proclaimed. But another 15, maybe 20, 25% of the world lives in areas where they will never hear the gospel unless missionaries, pioneer missionaries, go there. That represents the challenge of what hasn't yet happened. Here then is the 1040 window. There you can see that area that I have just mentioned. You can see that box or window on that part of the world that is most needy. Louis Bush will surely mention it again. So that is my first point, and the one that will take the most time. But the second trend in the world today is we have a unique message, but it is often compromised. We have a unique message, but it is often compromised. Look what Jesus said. And this gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom, that is the message that saves people from their sins, sets them ready, makes them ready as the bride of Christ for heaven. This is the wonderful message that changes sinners into saints. And so we are proclaiming the gospel, but I am concerned that many evangelicals are losing their confidence in the uniqueness of that gospel. That gospel is what people need. So we find many evangelicals today who say we must be involved in social things. True. But often the people who emphasize social things actually forget the proclamation of the gospel. What use is it to proclaim the love of Jesus through our social deeds, helping the poor, the sick, the maimed, and so on, if we do not also give them a fellowship of believers to which they can join? We must always have in balance the social challenge of the gospel and the spiritual challenge. If we do one without the other, it is a partial gospel. But we must aim to see churches of believers formed where this gospel is proclaimed and loved and learned. And so we find that as evangelicalism becomes more popular, we find it is often getting watered down. In many parts of the world where I preach, I find that the message of the blood of the Lamb is rarely preached except at the communion table. I find that amongst evangelicals it is rarely preached the eternity of heaven and of hell. I find it rarely preached a clear message of repentance from sin and dead works and faith in the finished work of Jesus. I find a greater emphasis on counseling. Now, counseling is not wrong, but if it doesn't lead to a godly repentance, it is not adequate. It is humanism in an evangelical dress. So therefore, as we look at this unique message, let us make quite sure we keep it unique. Without Jesus, no man can come to the Father. A good Muslim is not going to heaven because he's a good Muslim, but because he repents and believes in Jesus. Therefore, we should have an urgency to proclaim this gospel. But my concern today is that amongst evangelicals, we are watering down our message. So we're mixing in the West, we're mixing the gospel with materialism. We have the prosperity message. In Africa and Latin America, we're mixing it with elements of paganism. In South Asia, we're mixing Christianity with a kind of universalism. And in East Asia, it's often being mixed with ancestor worship and other things. Or ancestor veneration is perhaps a better way of putting it. So we have a loss of confidence all over the world in the uniqueness of the message. Unless we keep that uniqueness, we are not going to have the urgency to go and the willingness to sacrifice or even lay down our lives for this gospel. And tragically, we have a unique message, but we are often not preaching it as a unique message. What I mean by that in another way is that often Brazilians go to Portugal, which speaks Portuguese, a different kind of Portuguese, and then they think that those Portuguese must learn to speak Brazilian Portuguese to be a good Christian. Is it possible that Korean missionaries are going to another part of the world and they think that therefore, because God is blessed with prayer mountains, with early morning prayer meetings, this is the pattern for every part of the world? It may not be. We must not export our culture, even our Christian culture. We have to be very careful not to build empires for Jesus, but the kingdom of Jesus. And so therefore I want to give a challenge that you, as you begin to get involved in preaching this gospel, don't repeat the mistakes of the past. The third trend I see today, and given in the words of Jesus here, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, or it should be all peoples. And here we see the third point. There is a great clarity about information about what needs to be done, but it is not being used enough. My book has been sold, I think there are now possibly 500,000 copies of this edition that have been printed. But there are probably 250 million evangelicals in the world. Many have never even read anything about what's happening in other parts of the world. I want to challenge you to get information about the world, because for the first time we now see something of the picture of what must be done. I'm not just saying that because I wrote that book, but get it if you can, and then you can read about those parts of the world and pray for them, and maybe God will send you. We have information today that can help us to finish the gospel. Let me just show you this in very brief form. Here you can see the whole world. The darker the color, the fewer the born-again Christians. That is basically what this map tells us. Notice those areas of the world where there are very few Christians. If we are going to finish the job Jesus gave us to do, it is to those darker areas that we need to go with the gospel. But how is it as far as the countries of the world are concerned? We have a fairly good idea of what the need of the different countries are. Until 2 months ago, there were 237 countries and territories in the world. It is now 238, because a little country in the Caribbean has divided. St. Christopher and Nevis has divided into two countries, St. Christopher and Nevis, two little tiny islands. So it's now 238. But look at how far the gospel has gone. These different bars show the number of countries that are over 50% Christian in name, and those that have hardly any Christians. There are 149 or 150 now countries that are majority Christian. Only 29 countries in the world have less than 1% of their population that is Christian. That's much less than many people realize. But most of those in this area, the 0 to 10%, most of those are the countries in the 10-40 window. We are running out of countries to send missionaries where nobody is working. Do you know that? Our problem today is not to find new countries where there are no missionaries, but how we work together with Christians of different nationalities who are going to the same country that needs Jesus. That is our biggest challenge today. That is different to what it was 30 years ago. And so we find that in various parts of the world there's tremendous variety of needs. Here's the major part of Asia. And here you can see the darker the color, the fewer the born-again Christians. The lighter the color, the more the evangelical Christians. And so you can see some of those countries in Asia are still needy pioneer fields. Some are becoming mighty, sending missionary nations. But there are whole countries that need missionaries in Asia. The same is true in Africa. Here you can see a map of Africa showing the different countries, some with many evangelicals, others with hardly any. So there are whole countries in the world that still need the gospel. The same is true in Europe. Some countries have many Christians. Others have hardly any evangelical believers. That's why we need Korean and American missionaries in Europe, but they need to understand the situation. But we can also take a country and break it down into its different districts. Here, of course, is Japan. And you can see those red areas represent areas where there's not yet a church of believing Christians. So you can see even within a country there can be some areas with lots of churches and others with few. So we begin to know the true situation in many parts of the world. You, of course, are deeply concerned with the challenge, or let's get that right, with the challenge of North Korea. What is going to happen when that land opens for Jesus and Korea again becomes united? Please don't make the mistakes of thinking that the culture is the same. Be sensitive. It's a very different situation there. But our concern also is not only for the world, but also for the peoples in the world. And here you can see what I want to really wind things down to. Different cultures shown, not the countries now, but the peoples. Now when we look at the 1040 window area, in the 82,000 and beyond movement, we have grouped together those peoples in the Joshua list into 10 different blocks of peoples in that part of the world, like the Arab world, the Turkic peoples, the East Asian peoples, the Indians, the Horn of Africa peoples, the Malay, and so on. We can group together nearly all the least evangelized peoples on earth into those 10 different major blocks. And we need to have strategies for each of these areas. But then within each of those areas are many peoples. This shows the peoples of the world that still need the gospel. Let me try and show you how far we have got with bringing the gospel to the peoples of the world. There are about 12,000 peoples in the world. Not Ralph Winter's figure of 24,000 that I'm using here. He has subdivided others in ways that I do not fully understand. But here you can see 6,000 of the 12,000 have a majority that are Christian. Another 3,000 have many Christians. For instance, the Koreans are part of this. In Korea, the Christians are not yet 50% of the population, but look how many churches there are. So these peoples here represent the evangelized with many churches. These 3,000 represent the less evangelized or not evangelized. Some with some churches and some missionaries, some with virtually nothing. And you can see here marked in the darker color those that are in the list of the Joshua Project, those that are over 10,000 in population and less than 5% Christian or 2% evangelical. But when we look as far as the missionaries are concerned, we see how far we have got. Here you can see divided out by whether there are any known churches, a few individual Christians, one congregation. These other colors show whether there are missionaries working there. But look at these peoples here. No missions known to be working amongst those peoples in the Joshua Project list. The number is not as high as many people would say. The point I want to bring over is that we have a finishable job, but we need to send people to peoples like the Kurds, the Tuareg, and many others that I could show you. I don't have time to do that. My time is gone. I'll tell you more in the seminar if you come to my seminar. But there are two other points that you'll find in your notes. The fourth thing that Jesus said is, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. He told us about preaching and testifying. He indicated there must be a mobilization of God's people to see the job done. Now, one of the exciting things that's happening in the world today is that over the last 15 years, the missionary vision has become global. In my own agency, we have 1,700 missionaries in my agency. But we come from 43 different nations. We have now 27 Koreans in our mission. And we see this multiculturalization of the missionary force. It's exciting. And so we're seeing this mobilization, but we're going to have to learn some solemn lessons of how we work together. We must do the job together. We cannot do it alone. You'll see some notes that I cannot go into. But the final thing I want to end with is that Jesus said here, and then the end will come. The fourth trend that I want to point out is a trend to conclusion, to completion, to what some people call closure, finishing the job Jesus gave us to do. It can be done, and it should be done, and we should be the people that do it. Shall we do it together? Hallelujah.